Howard Wahlberg, Director of Marketing for AFCEA International, and I'd like to welcome you to our Signal online event, Cybersecurity Best Practices, Learn and Apply the NIST Framework. A security framework established by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is serving as a template for protecting networks using a threat-centric approach. One aspect focuses on cybersecurity, while the other entails risk management. NIST's approach is designed to be scalable to any size organization, including large government agencies. Private industry is already adopting the NIST framework to help ensure better organizational cybersecurity. In today's online event, we'll take a look at how one company has incorporated the NIST approach into a security framework that covers the timeline before, during, and after a cyber attack. Hosting today's event is Bob Ackerman, the editor-in-chief of Signal magazine. Bob has nearly 3 decades of experience at Signal, covering information technology in military and national security settings, more than half of these as editor-in-chief. Joining Bob to explain how the NIST framework can be applied is Cisco's Steve Kamey, a cybersecurity solutions specialist with Cisco. Steve has more than 20 years of experience in information security, computer networking, and telecommunications. He currently focuses on helping government leaders protect their agencies from cybersecurity threats. During the event, viewers are encouraged to submit any questions they may have by simply clicking on our Ask a Question feature, which you can find by hovering over your media player and clicking on the small hand towards the bottom right. Steve will attempt to answer as many questions as time permits towards the end of the event. With that, let me turn over the event to Bob Ackerman. Bob?
Thank you, Howard, and welcome to all of you joining us today for this presentation. Now again, as Howard said, the Ask a Question box is the key toward finding out what answers you may need in the course of our presentation. Steve will be going through quite a few slides and discussing quite a few points, so don't hesitate to send your questions in as soon as they come up. In the meantime, again, I want to thank you for joining us. We'll have several slides through the presentation, and we hope you'll find this informative. I will also be asking questions of Steve as things proceed. So Steve, welcome to AFCEA. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. My first question really deals with the NIST framework. Really, is it a single framework? I looked on their website and I saw what seemed to be 2.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's actually, I think it's probably worth dispelling that myth right off the bat, right? When a lot of times people say the NIST framework, a lot of times it sounds like there's only a single framework, and quite frankly, there's at least 2, right? When we talk about the word framework, NIST recently released the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Sometimes we just abbreviate that to CSF. That came out of the executive order addressing critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Prior to that, NIST had already released the NIST Risk Management Framework. That's a much, bigger process, right? There's a NIST publication for each of the different steps. Things like categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor. It's a very big risk management framework. But clearly, there are 2 different frameworks, right? We have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is, I think, the focus of our, conversation today. But I do want to point out the difference, right, between that and the NIST Risk Management Framework. Finally, I think a lot of times we think of NIST Special Publication 800-53 as a framework as well, right? That's the Security Control Catalog for Federal Information Systems. 18 control families, 460 pages, right? There's a lot of best practices in there, but clearly all of these things are interrelated. So I'm sure we'll cover the different aspects of that through the course of our conversation today.
Okay, well, why don't you take us down that path?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we'll start off is with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the CSF. Sort of like I said at the beginning, in February, I guess, of 2013, President Obama signed an executive order recognizing the importance of critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Right? When you think about the Internet of Things and we're connecting things like water treatment plants and nuclear power plants and so forth, we've seen that there's a lot of good operational reasons to do these things, right? To automate and make things run more efficiently and so forth. But at the same time, I think we all know that the more things that we connect to the internet, especially the things that don't necessarily have security built into them, right? We need to start thinking in terms of cybersecurity. So a lot of critical infrastructure providers needed additional guidance, right? A simple framework to pick up to help understand and manage cybersecurity risks within the context, right, of their capabilities. So that was the genesis of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. NIST sat down for a year, right, after that executive order, working with both public and private sector to figure out which security controls are the ones that are working most effectively. Right, they couldn't take NIST Special Publication 800-53 and throw it at a critical infrastructure provider. It wouldn't quite be successful, that way. So the initial intent was to sit down and sort of basically whittle down, right, which are the controls that are actually really working effectively today. And not only that, to outline a process by which cybersecurity risk management can take place in order to build out that cybersecurity roadmap. I think when we talked about contrasting that with the NIST risk management framework, a lot of us in the DoD audience here is probably thinking along that line, right? We know that there's a DoD instruction that pointed out, right, the shift from the old DIACAP program over to the NIST risk management framework. And clearly, that kind of effort is a multi-year effort, right? It's something that we wouldn't dream of, putting on a critical infrastructure provider like a power utility, for example, right? It's a multi-year process, and to try to pick up a big, heavy framework like the risk management framework, it would be quite a task.
Okay, your perspective, though. How are you taking advantage of this?
Yeah, I think one thing about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is that, first of all, the title is a bit of a misnomer now, right? Ever since it came out in, the early part of 2014, the title of it is the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. But as time has gone on, right, as we've even heard, during the introduction, is that organizations of all sizes can actually pick up and adopt this framework. It's not just for, for cybersecurity or for critical infrastructure, providers. A small K-12 school district can pick up the cybersecurity framework and bolster, their cybersecurity defenses. I think a big aspect of the framework is how, sort of simple it is, right, to pick up and understand. It drives a common language around to discuss cybersecurity, right? It puts cybersecurity in 5 key areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Right? It's actually become the way I started thinking about cybersecurity, because everything, fits in those 5 buckets. And the cybersecurity framework makes that really simple and easy to drive a cybersecurity conversation, both inside an organization with vendors like Cisco, right, in order to just generally improve, right, us to figure out how we all work together. I think we recognize that cybersecurity is increasingly becoming a board level conversation, right? It's up to the highest ranks in military and federal government and so forth. So the better way that we use a construct like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and its 5 key functional areas makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, well, I know you have some slides and other things you'd like to present, so why don't you go right ahead with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the CSF is made up of 3 things, right? The first thing that I mentioned was the framework core. Those are those 5 key areas that split up those security controls that NIST spent a whole year, right, working through, figuring out which controls are the most effective, right? So if you think of the framework core, picture a table, right, of all those different controls organized by those 5 functional areas, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And the fantastic part also about the framework core is it's not reinventing any wheels. There's an aspect within the framework core called informative resources. So when it comes time to dig into one of those areas and realize that, hey, we don't have a good software inventory or we don't have a good hardware inventory, we can actually use the framework to find those specific areas within existing best practices. It could be NIST Special Publication 800-53, or it could be the ISO 27000 series, the COBIT 5 framework and so forth. So it doesn't really matter ultimately what deeper level best practice an organization might choose to follow. The framework is meant to laser guide them to the areas that are putting their organization at risk and to put that roadmap together, right, to develop and improve cybersecurity over time. Does that make sense so far?
So far, please continue.
So the second aspect is that what you see on the bottom part of the chart is what's called the framework implementation tiers. It's one thing to have a list of all the best practices to consider, right? But we also need to figure out how well we're doing today. So NIST, the cybersecurity framework, has put out there a concept called implementation tiers to enable organizations to be able to do an assessment against the framework core and just determine how well we're doing, right? So if we don't have an inventory management system, maybe we have an Excel spreadsheet, maybe it's a best effort to try to keep it up to date, maybe it's not automated. An organization like that might say that for their hardware inventories, maybe they're only a tier 1, right? It's an ad hoc process. It's not fully established within the organization. And that can range all the way up to tier 4, which would be a completely automated process, something that's continually updated, a process that's continually improved. Everyone knows and understands it. And I think you can kind of see that anywhere in between. So the goal, like we talked about, is to take the cybersecurity framework, use it as a way in conjunction with the implementation tiers to get an assessment of where that organization is today. Right? I think that's the first step in anything, is knowing where you are today. So finally, the framework profile, which is the third of the 3 components that we show in our slide here, pulls all that stuff together. Right? So picture an organization doing a current assessment of their organization using the framework core, and they've already done that assessment at tier 1, 2, 3, and 4 as they go through the entire framework. The first step is to capture that in what's called a current profile. Right? That literally is what captures where the organization is today. And clearly it makes sense at that point, right? The next step would be to conduct a risk-based assessment of that current profile, right? Just because you're at tier 1 doesn't necessarily mean that you need to fix it, right? The control that's in place could be adequate for its function. It all depends on the risks that are facing that organization. So the point, obviously, of doing that, that risk-based assessment is to drive what's called a target profile, right? So contrast the concepts of current profile, where the organization is today, with a target profile, which is really the risk-based roadmap of where that organization needs to go. Right? So picture 2 or 3 things that we realize that are really putting that organization at risk. The cybersecurity framework helps guide organizations to figure out what those things are, work together as an organization to come to agreement on those things, and then to actually build the roadmap using the target profile concepts. So that's how all 3 of those components come together. Right? The framework core is those list of security controls, right, that are linked to existing best practices. The tiers are a way to assess how the organization is doing against those controls. And the profiles are meant to capture where that organization is today in a current profile and help them develop 1 or more target profiles in order to laser focus their efforts. Right? We know we can't do everything at once, so that's why the NIST puts such a clear process around improving cybersecurity and doing it in a way that we can manage it with existing resources.
Mm-hmm. But why would the target profile differ from an existing risk profile?
Well, I think in a lot of organizations, they would pick up the NIST cybersecurity framework because they really needed help. Right? So one of the things that NIST has put out there is that there are a number of different ways to use the cybersecurity framework, and one of them is either to establish or to improve an existing cybersecurity program. Right? So some organizations may turn to use the cybersecurity framework because of its simplicity, because of its increasing ubiquitousness, right? And also because it makes it simple, right, to actually drive that process. So we're not saying that the cybersecurity framework is the end all and be all for all organizations. Some may choose to follow a different route. Right? I think that's why NIST put this out there as a voluntary framework instead of it's not a compliance mandate. This isn't PCI compliance or FISMA or anything. This is a voluntary set of controls that an organization can pick up, and a voluntary process for them to see about improving their cybersecurity programs with it.
What advantage does it offer, since it is voluntary, over previous approaches?
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage, in my opinion, is the fact that it helps organizations laser focus on the areas that are putting the organization at risk. Right? Everybody can come in, vendors can come into an organization and say, hey, this is, we're going to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt around a certain area, right? But until an organization actually conducts that risk-based assessment and gets on board with what their roadmap is, I think that's the way to make sure that they're using their limited resources effectively. Right? And it's not just dollar resources, it's people. Right? We know that there's just not enough cybersecurity professionals that are out there, right, to actually do the work. Right, so the people that we do have in our organizations and agencies and departments, we need to make sure that we're focusing their efforts on the most important things. So I think that, to me, is the biggest power of the cybersecurity framework that helps laser focus on those things that are going to bring risk down to an acceptable level in an organization, and to do it in a way that's structured and gets the rest of the organization on board with the roadmap.
All right, we discussed those 3 aspects. What next?
Yeah, so I think that the next step is maybe just to do a slightly bit deeper into the framework itself, right? Because we can talk a little bit about it at the high level and its purpose. But sometimes it's worth just doing a quick deconstruction of what the framework is. So you remember I talked about the framework core, right? It's a table of those best practices. And the first thing that I point out, and like I mentioned earlier, is that it's aligned around the 5 key areas of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Right? These aren't meant to be done sequentially. It's meant to be done, you have to take a look against all of these controls. But what I like about this is having a common, simple language to talk about cybersecurity. The framework core is structured at a high level, right? Those high level functions, they're split out into categories and subcategories. But when the rubber meets the road, right? When we actually get down to, say, a specific control like hardware inventories and software inventories, that's where it also links to what's called the informative resources, right? Remember how I mentioned it points you to specific areas within the existing best practices. So that, again, it's not just saying, hey, now turn to NIST 800-53 and rip open a 460-page document, right? It actually links them specifically to the area like, CM-8, for example, right, for component inventories. That's a key aspect of what the framework brings to the table.
You said they're not sequential, but they do seem to be chronological. That is to say, one precedes the other. So why are they not sequential?
Yeah, I think everything in cybersecurity has to be thought of as being done continuously, right? We know the threats are constantly evolving, right? So we know that there's controls that we need to put in place, before, during, and after an attack, right? Which is the attack continuum that we've already heard, during the introduction. But we have to put all those controls in place. The right controls in place, right, across all 5 of those disciplines. So let me give you an example. An attack might not have hit an agency quite yet, but what if that attack actually does occur, right? Well, if all they've done is focused on the identify and protect functions of the cybersecurity framework, what are they going to use to detect that attack is actually occurring, right? We've heard about breaches that can spend 200, 300, 400 days without ever knowing that, for example, advanced malware got into the organization and all kinds of data is leaking out. So the framework in this specific example shows that we have to put all those controls in place and think across all 5 of those core functions because they all work together. Right? We have to be able to do a better job of bringing that time to detection down so that we can respond a lot more quickly, right? Ideally in an automated fashion, right? And not having to do human beings do all the work, but clearly that leads us to the next step, right? The respond function. Right? We have to be able to scope, contain, remediate. We need to get things, stop the damage essentially. And then finally move into the recover phase, which is, not only learn lessons, but also what's our communication plan going to be? How do we address maintenance activities and all those kinds of things? So to your point about, how they don't, kind of seem sequential, and I agree that they do. But when you actually take a look at it and split it apart, you realize that you have to think about all 5 of these things, together. The important point, though, of course, is trying to figure out with that risk assessment where organizations are lacking and where they really need to improve.
Okay, so you've got the 5 areas identified.
Yeah.
Where do you go from here?
Right. So the next step is obviously improving that program. Right. So I've talked a little bit about this, but sometimes it's worth just kind of seeing it on a slide, because the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, right? They put out a number of different uses. Some people just use the framework for a way to talk about cybersecurity. How do we talk apples to apples? So for example, OMB last fall came out with the Cybersecurity Strategy and Implementation Plan, right, for federal agencies. That was all done within the language of the framework, right? When you look at that OMB memorandum, it's done in terms of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. That's one way to use the framework as a way to talk about cybersecurity, but perhaps the most important and the most relevant for our audience today is, well, how do we pick it up and use it, right? So the slide that we've shown here is directly out of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and it talks about the steps that are necessary to use the framework in a continuous fashion, right? To use all 5 aspects of the cybersecurity framework to bring risk down to an acceptable level, right? So in the first step here, right, it's understanding of the priority and scope. We have to understand what our risk management strategy is. We have to understand risk tolerance, right? We have to know what's important to us and maybe what's not as important. In the second step, the orient, you need to understand what vulnerabilities are facing the organization or the agency. We need to know what are the threat vectors. If we have a web application out there that connects to a back-end database, but we need to understand, right, the different types of threat vectors that could affect, right, operations or critical information and so forth. The third part is where I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the framework, is about developing that current profile, right? So taking the framework core, assessing the organization, and just getting a snapshot, using those framework implementation tiers of where the organization is today, right? So then clearly, I think we mentioned this before, in step 4 is conducting the risk assessment against that current profile. And the whole point of that, obviously, is to develop one or more target profiles that focus on a couple of key areas that are going to be the most bang for the buck. That's where I see is such the power of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, is laser focusing on the things that are going to bring risk down to an acceptable level, and letting the things that can wait, so let's let them wait. Right, and obviously you have to, to finish the close of the loop here, right? You have to analyze the gaps between where you are today and where you want to be, and of course that will help, lead towards understanding what action plan needs to occur, right? And again, I think we talked about in the framework core, it links back to those informative resources that shows you whether you choose to follow COBIT or you follow NIST, or if you want to follow the ISO 27000 series. It gives you those links to the existing best practices for those couple of key areas that are most important. So where do we go from here? Well, we use this to make an initial pass through that, and let's mitigate the most important risks. But like we talked about too, in cybersecurity, there is no once and done, right? We have to continually improve. Threats constantly evolve. We've seen increasing in the news a lot of ransomware types of attacks, right? So we in cybersecurity, I think a lot of times we think of confidentiality and integrity first. But I think we're starting to see that the availability aspect of that triangle is so important as well, right? If medical records become unavailable, it's extremely important. So the real power here is what you're seeing on that slide is about improving that cybersecurity program using a best practice like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework in a way that's really simple and easy.
Okay, so we have the 5 steps as outlined by NIST. How do you architecture that into a way in which you can get your arms around it?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that too, because it's at least in the first pass, NIST is considering an updated revision to the framework early next calendar year. They just met. Well, they're constantly looking to evolve, right? So
Fair
the framework
enough.
workshop in early April brought back together a lot of people to talk about where the framework could improve and so forth. But one of the aspects that they mentioned, about the framework is using it as a way to, sort of as a baseline, right, to figure out where the cybersecurity, the risks are and so forth. But also they recognized how they could potentially bring to the table more tools to let the organization go and take and architect that. NIST was actually very clear about not providing a profile template, right? What they envision is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework being picked up and plopped into an organization's existing risk management program.
Yep.
Right. So years ago, I did a cooperative education, rotation through a nuclear power plant. Right. That plant could handle significant problems like a loss of offsite power combined with a loss of coolant accident. That's a major catastrophe, right, for an organization, for a nuclear power plant. But when it comes to cybersecurity risks, right, I can't say, I don't work with that organization anymore, but my guess is they're probably less prepared. So in an ideal world, that power utility would pick up the cybersecurity framework, plug it into what they're already doing to manage all of the other risks that face that plant, not only in terms of operations, but in terms of security, right? And baking it into their existing processes. So that's really the initial plan for the architecture is, use it with what you're already doing for risk management. Okay,
so what are you folks doing? What's your approach?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because, a lot of times human beings tend to think in threes. I think I learned that at the nuclear plant. They showed us that on the
Trinity
control panel, right? We don't want to, sometimes 5 things, maybe that's a lot. But we here at Cisco, we think of cybersecurity in terms of the attack continuum, right? Every organization is going to be attacked. 20 years ago, we spent so much time just trying to put up, the walls and keep the bad guys out. But things have changed, right? 20 years ago, we also didn't have these mobile devices, we didn't have cloud applications and so forth. So the way Cisco approaches cybersecurity is addressing the full attack continuum. What are the capabilities that are necessary before an attack occurs? What are the capabilities necessary while an attack is occurring, right, to reduce that time to detection? And also what needs to be done after, right? So when we think of threes, it's really kind of simple to think about that sort of at a high level, right? What are the controls we need to put in place first? Well, clearly we need to do things like, put firewall technologies in place. We need to make sure that we have, good configuration management plans and so forth. We know that, making configuration changes without, managing them, right, can put organizations at risk and so forth. So those things that we are trying to do to prevent attacks from occurring and succeeding, right, that's still important. But clearly, we need to start thinking about the during phase and actually knowing when an attack has actually occurred. Like we mentioned before, some organizations can go hundreds of days without knowing that malware or there's a vulnerability, right, that hasn't been addressed, right? So we have to be able to reduce that time to detection, and Cisco, focuses on that phase, obviously, with things like, next generation intrusion prevention platforms and, advanced malware protection and so forth. And then finally, the capabilities that are necessary after an attack, right? When an attack occurs and it succeeds, once you detect it, it's so important to be able to understand its scope, right? How far did it go? What systems were impacted? So that we can contain it, right, and take the right action. And then finally, to remediate, right? If we understand where the scope is and what systems were affected and how, then clearly we have the right capabilities necessarily to remediate. And so when you look at something like, before, during, and after as, the capabilities that are necessary to address the full attack continuum, I think you can kind of see how it has those roots in best practices. You can see the alignment with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. The before phase clearly aligns with, identify and protect. The during phase clearly aligns with detect, right? And the after phase clearly aligns with respond and recover, right? So this is the way we think about cybersecurity. It's not just a marketing tagline. It's actually a construct about cybersecurity that's rooted in best practices.
This also takes out that sequential designation that you said doesn't apply, because you've got some overlap between before, during, and after.
Yeah, I think you're right, and there's no, obviously all these things have to work together, right? Because I don't think you can, pen, specific technologies or processes in, any specific kind of area. So, for example, an access control type of solution might get a signal from something that, detects suspicious network traffic patterns, right? Imagine if there's an Oracle database that holds sensitive citizen information, and it typically communicates with 3 systems on a normal basis, and all of a sudden one day it starts sending a pile of traffic to a new location, right? There's technologies out there that can sense that change in network traffic patterns and then send that signal back to the before phase access control system to quarantine that, right? So it's meant, to work together, right? And to your point, it's not sequential. It's, have to take a look at cybersecurity in total.
Okay, so you've got the groupings, the 3 different groupings. What next?
Yeah, so it's obviously there's always more detail, right, to accomplish that. So without spending a ton of time on various Cisco products and technologies, the first thing we mentioned is the importance of people, process, and technology all have to work together. But from a technology perspective, there are certain next generation modern cybersecurity tools that are available, and what you'll see on the slide here are solutions like that, like Cisco's Advanced Malware Protection, Cisco's Identity Services Engine, Cisco's Next Generation Firewall and Intrusion Prevention Platform. And what we've done is not just sort of aligned our market high-level message with the Cybersecurity Framework, is we've also aligned the product capabilities so that it's very clear. Right? If a customer or an agency comes to us and says, hey, this is what our target profile looks like, it has these 3 things on it, we've already done the work in terms of aligning their requirements with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, so we know exactly how to help them from a technology perspective. And of course, it's not just about technology, right? It has to do with people and process as well. Right? So Cisco also has a full set of advisory services for organizations to help pick up and understand how to pick up and manage a cybersecurity program. We know how to integrate the technologies that we just talked about, and finally, we can manage, all kinds of solutions, right? Because organizations just don't have enough people, right? Agencies don't have enough people, to deploy a lot of the solutions that they want. So we look at it from a people, process, and technology across the entire board there.
That was going to be my next question. You've walked into it, so I'll ask the question. You're putting in a totally new approach to cybersecurity. It is based on the NIST framework. But in fact, how do you train? How difficult is it to train an organization's people to step in and suddenly greet this new framework that you folks have put together? It's not just the NIST framework. It's your own flavor, so to speak. Yeah,
I think NIST would be a great people to ask that, right? NIST Outreach has been out there trying to get people to understand the cybersecurity framework and so forth. I would love for them to comment on how long it takes, right, for organizations. It's clearly why they're doing the outreach and so forth. But
your company is doing this for them.
Oh, absolutely.
So tell me about that,
right.
please.
So from an advisory, services perspective, Cisco has a number of experts who focus on strategy and risk management consulting, right? So we understand best practices, not just the cybersecurity framework, but the ISO 27000 series, right? International type of frameworks that we're not even going to mention here today. But the point is that when it comes to like picking up a framework like the cybersecurity framework, it's one thing to understand what needs to be done. It's a whole other thing to be able to figure out how to take and make that happen in an organization successfully, right? So our strategy and risk management consulting and our advisory services help organizations of any size, right, pick up an existing best practice, right? Because our mission is just like that of the federal government, right? We want to make sure that we can protect, sensitive information, citizen data, all this nation's intellectual property. So we think that laser focusing every, the Department of Defense, laser focusing federal agencies, right, state, local, higher ed, across the public sector board. If we can get everybody focused on the things that are going to bring risk down to an acceptable level, I think that's a big win, right? So that's a key aspect of what Cisco brings to the table.
Okay, a moment ago you posted a slide with a large number of security products. What I'd like to know is, would you employ all those services for an organization, or would you just do one within each category? Is that an a la carte menu or a fixed price menu? Or do you just have a combination of those services? Would you just tailor them, one from box A, B, C, D, or E, as needed? What's your approach there?
Well, I think the first approach would be is that if an organization can show us their target profile, right? So if, let's say, we have an agency has already picked up the cybersecurity framework, right? We talked about the importance of creating that risk-based target profile. If they can bring that target profile to us, that's their roadmap, right? Which is one of the reasons why we put a slide like this together, right? They might say that the first 2 lines on this are the ones that are most important. We don't have any idea what hardware is out there. We don't have any idea what software is out there. So that's putting our agency at risk. Right, so what we've already done is aligned our technologies. Things like, for example, Cisco's Identity Services Engine. Right, what it does is profile devices as they connect to the network. Right, an iPad that connects to the network, we profile it and understand what it is. Right, if you have Windows 2000 devices still out there, it profiles those devices by reading what it communicates on the network in order to classify those devices. Right, no one's going to say that's an inventory management system, but knowing what's connecting to your network is certainly the first step. And then secondly, things like software inventories, right? We have to be able to make sure that we understand what type of software is running on the network. So our firepower, type platforms read that off the network and understand what applications, what ports and protocols and so forth, right? With an application awareness, right? And can give that information back and say, hey, did you actually know that these applications were out there and running? Right? So giving that level of visibility, but based on a target profile that comes from a customer, would be astounding, right? If we get that target profile, we know exactly what to do. But to your point, a lot of organizations can't necessarily show us a target profile, right? So they need help in picking up the cybersecurity framework, figuring out where to focus first, and we can help them get to what that target profile needs to be, right? And then ultimately, right, now we have the 2, 3, 4 areas that we need to focus on, then we can take it from there.
If someone does hand you a target profile, you express gratitude with the idea that they will have done that work first. Do you just take it for granted? Do you assume that it follows the NIST format and therefore must be good, or do you take a second look at it?
Well, I mean, we would like to, right? Obviously, we don't immediately just process the data, right? So what happens is we use our account teams, plug in, right? We have great, consulting systems engineers, and they're called consulting systems engineers for a reason, right? They come in there and ask questions, and how did you arrive at this, and that kind of stuff, right? They're not there to question anyone's judgment, but to your point, right? Sometimes people, what they're really asking for isn't what they write down. So our account teams are very skilled at understanding what the real requirements are and where we should really focus.
Now, organizations change, IT changes.
Yes, it does.
We all know there's probably no greater font of change in the world today than information technology. So that target assessment would probably change too. How often do you revisit that?
Yeah, I think so revisiting it is obviously, I think it's per organization, right? I think every organization is going to have a different capacity to pick up and run the cybersecurity framework and go back through it, right? So
But would the revisit be based on time or based on, say, changes to the IT architecture, such as suddenly equipping people in the field with a different kind of mobile device?
Honestly, I hate to answer this way, but I would say both. Right? I'd say it has to be based on time first, right? Because we have to put some kind of roadmap together and actually accomplish those goals. But at the same time, we can't put a target profile together, make it a year worth project, and then close our eyes and then pretend that, or hope that the cybersecurity landscape doesn't change in the meantime, right? So I think an organization that picks up the framework is going to build out a target profile that focuses the organization on where they're really trying to improve, while at the same time monitoring for changes in their organization, right? Maybe a new application's rolled out, or maybe something has changed the risk profile of the organization during the point at which that target profile is actually trying to be executed against. So I hate to say both, but I think that has to be done, right? Because we just can't close our eyes for a year and hope that the environment doesn't change.
Right. Generally, how long would the minimum be if you're just going to rely on time exclusively?
Yeah, I mean, my gut would tell me, and I would love to have our advisory services guys here, right? Because they've worked through this, a number of times, and could probably give actual statistics. But my guess would be the absolute minimum would be something like 6 months.
Okay.
Right? But probably for more organizations, it's probably a year-long effort is to, from the time that we've developed the target profile to the time that we've actually accomplished where our mission is, right? Maybe we want to go from tier 1 all the way to tier 4 in just 2 areas of the framework. That could be a lot of work, right? And especially based upon the resources of that organization. So I suspect that anything would be at least a year.
I mean, even if the organization doesn't change its IT architecture.
Exactly.
Some do rapidly, others are more given to a little bit of inertia, and that could be for budgetary reasons as much as anything. You're still going to have the threat changing, so how do you accommodate that?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I mean, I think what has to happen is that we have to put that plan in place and execute against it, right? But like I said, there's a reason why there's a chief information security officer role, right? There's a reason why we have the security operations teams. There's a reason why DHS is backing up the federal agencies with with all kinds of additional cybersecurity intelligence, and working with industry like Cisco, for example, right, to share information about threat vectors and so forth. So I think every organization needs to keep their ear to the ground for what is new and what's changing, right, in order to make sure that the target profile that's being executed against is still the right thing to be doing. It has to be done.
Let me ask this from the perspective of a government organization.
Sure.
Is this security process, once installed and up and running, is it government-owned or government-operated or contractor-operated?
I would say it has to be government operated initially, right? I don't think anyone would turn and say, hey, we're just going to turn all of security over to these contractors, right?
A lot of IT is becoming government-owned, contractor-operated. So I wondered if that applies to your security approach.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like Cisco, for example, I think we showed on this slide here about how we offer things like managed services, right? So we can come in and manage technology and so forth. Let's say there's firewall and intrusion prevention systems that the agency just can't, they don't have the resources to manage and keep up to date and configure and all that kind of stuff, tune them. Cisco can come along and do that. But I think, to your initial question, at least, my initial read of it was that, the federal agency is, or the DoD department or whoever, is still going to own that, they still have responsibility for their cybersecurity.
They're going to own it.
Program, exactly.
But operating it.
Right.
That's the question.
Yeah, I think so. My guess is it'll be a combination of a mix. A lot of the security operations centers that I've been to, at least on the federal civilian side, have a mix of both, like to your point, contractors in there to do a lot of the work, but also a lot of oversight, from the government as well.
Does your system allow it to be completely government-owned and government-operated?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But if they want contractor operation in some way, shape, or form, that's also doable.
Yeah, so one of the key things about at least the cybersecurity technologies is that Cisco is laser focused on trying to make sure that these things are simple, right? That's so when we think about how cybersecurity needs to be kept, as simple as possible from a configuration, tuning, implementation perspective, but at the same time, it also has to be configured to be able to integrate and automate operations and so forth. We mentioned that example of, a database sending a whole pile of traffic, in some suspicious direction one morning, right? We want to make sure that that technology that senses the network traffic, pattern change can actually go back and signal the device that's going to quarantine, the database, or maybe do an update to the network security, profile, right? The actual segmentation type profile. So I point that out there because we try to keep things as simple as possible and make sure that if things like APIs or a partner framework to make sure that all the technologies can seamlessly work together.
You earlier mentioned that NIST is working on the next step in this framework. I don't know that you have any inclination of where it might go, but how are you prepared to respond when they change things? Again, change is, after all, the definition of IT.
I think, first of all, that might take us to our last slide here, right? So I wanted to point out that everything about the framework you can find at nist.gov/cyberframework. And the reason why I point that out is because that's one of the ways you can find out about the NIST framework workshops. The most recent one was early April in Gaithersburg, Maryland, right? They brought together, again, industry and public sector and so forth to talk about where the framework is and where it can be improved. And actually, I think it was just Monday of this week, they published a lot of the results, right, about what they've heard, right, and what they plan to act on. One of the things that they mentioned in that publication was the fact that a lot of organizations need additional help or tools for beyond just the conceptual level cybersecurity framework. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we had some kind of tool that would help us do assessments or track, right, our progress against the framework? So I think they recognize that as one of the points, putting out there. Secondly, when we first kicked off this, and we actually look at the title of our presentation, it says the NIST Framework. We mentioned earlier, right, that we have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which has been, obviously the crux of our conversation. But NIST also recognizes how important it's going to be to do a little bit better alignment with the NIST Risk Management Framework, right? Because when we start talking NIST frameworks out there, we want to be crystal clear on where and when to use. So, I've been thinking about the cybersecurity framework and maybe potentially as a stepping stone to maybe picking up something like the risk management framework, right? Because it's very simple, get your house in order. If you get your house in order against the cybersecurity framework, maybe you're ready to elevate to the, to the full risk management framework and pick that up and run with it. But NIST did recognize that is another potential area of improving the cybersecurity framework itself. But again, their full publication is available on nist.gov/cyberset. nist.gov/cyberframework is where they publish all that information.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're ready to go into questions now. Again, wield your cursor to get the Ask a Question box up, and feel free to submit them. I have a couple already, so let me start with those.
Okay.
One question is, what about physical environment security controls? That they must play a role somehow.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the first thing I'd point out is that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is called cybersecurity, for a reason, right? Because it doesn't focus as much on the physical types of controls. But I will point out, obviously, that anybody on this call that has opened the NIST Special Publication 800-53, which is also a step in the NIST Risk Management Framework, knows that there's a whole physical environment section within there, right? So any organization that wants to have better guidance from NIST on physical access controls, things like physical access control systems, fingerprint readers, all that kind of stuff, right? Those are the types of things that they could turn to NIST Special Publication 800-53 and actually pull up the physical environment section of that.
I don't think there's any doubt, given all the talk that's going around now, that we're going to see some totally new ways of physical environment security. Even if we're just talking about ID verification, that's going to change dramatically.
Absolutely.
So how are you poised to be able to react to that with your products, services, and your architecture?
Yeah, and another aspect of that is geolocation, information. Like where are we accessing this information from? Right, so context is extremely important, right? So everything that, when we think about cybersecurity, when we think about risk management and so forth, we think of what is the context in which it's operating. And the context can be physical location, right? It can be geolocation information. It could be a policy that says, hey, we don't expect to get this kind of traffic from a foreign country. We do all our work within the United States. I think you get the idea, right? So understanding and bridging the physical with the cyber is extremely important, and certainly an area where Cisco focuses.
But how flexible, I guess, is the word I'm looking for, are you? How does your system accommodate what could be a change coming not from NIST, but from some other part of the federal government? where suddenly perhaps it'll be an executive change where all identification forms suddenly are converted, so ordered. Can you accommodate that, and if so, how?
Can you give me a little more detail of what you mean?
All right, well, right now, look at your CAC card. Everyone is looking at it with suspicion, saying we got to do better than this. We may be doing retina scans.
Yeah.
I wouldn't doubt the day will come when DNA scans come on the spot,
Absolutely.
on site.
Yeah.
Point is, those might not come out from NIST as part of its own security framework. They may come down as a dictum from some other part of government. So, what do you do then, since you've just discussed how the physical element is so important?
Well, the one thing I do make sure I want to point out too is, Cisco gathers a lot of requirements from not just NIST, right? So what feeds into our roadmap, and even for things like connected safety and physical security and so forth, right? Our product management team is out there looking at all the trends, right, and commercial and so forth. So, right. So it's not just going to be like, hey, NIST didn't say it, so we're not going to do it, right?
You would have to incorporate
Exactly.
it. So that's what I'm asking is, you have the flexibility to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously that's a function of our strategy and product management teams who keep their ear to the ground for where things need to go, right, and how things need to integrate. So I think Cisco does a fantastic job of anticipating future needs and building that into the roadmap.
We've been talking in the light of government organizations. Obviously, this applies to commercial organizations as well. You have this security approach that can work with either sector. How well does it scale up, and does it change the emphasis within those three areas when it does scale up to, say, a larger or scale down to a smaller organization?
So I think when we look about scaling things like like the before, during, after type of construct, right? We want to make sure that we can cover, how many agencies that we have out there that do have people internationally. So, for example, we have those crypto things that are sent with 3 guys to monitor them because we can't export cryptography to a foreign country and so forth. So Cisco, we keep our ear to the ground again for those kinds of things. One of the things we've done recently is we've gotten cleared by the CIA for, I think it's called Commercial Solutions for Classified, CSFC.
Yes.
Right. So as a single vendor, we here at Cisco can actually do that, cryptography and from end to end without having to ship one of those, what are they called, Type 1 encryptors with 3 guys to monitor it in Japan. We can actually do that kind of encryption, and the ROI almost, kind of pays for itself, right? When you think about that kind of approach. Think of that as just one example of many in terms of things like scalability, right? We have to take into account not just what's putting an organization at risk, but budget limitations and where are the expenses, right? Where can we operate potentially more efficiently? So we constantly are looking for those types of ways to help organizations operate more effectively, right? It's a key aspect of what we do.
So scalability is not going to change the emphasis within. It's more likely to be shifted as a result of your own target analysis.
Well, I mean, definitely scalability, plays into any kind of device, right? There's a limit for So, obviously, we want to make sure that we can, have an architecture, right, that can scale up and scale down. It's one of the reasons why, Cisco does what we call CVDs, or Cisco validated designs, right? When it comes to things like data center architecture, we're talking about, big, massive, data centers, right? We're some of the largest organizations and federal agencies and so forth, right? So we publish these validated designs in order to show how to scale up and scale down and scale out, right? How do we manage the east-west traffic versus the north-south traffic? Cisco's been the leader in networking for 30 years, and trying to make sure that we can build out that architecture in a scalable way is obviously a key area for Cisco.
I guess sort of what I'm thinking is the first grouping, the first section. Does the emphasis on that change if you have a smaller organization vis-a-vis a much larger one?
It probably does. Yeah.
Okay.
It probably does, because there's a much bigger impact on things like budgets and so forth, right? Obviously, smaller organizations as a percentage of, the whatever, right, with the revenue or what have you, whatever budget they might get, for example, there's going to be a limit, to what they can do. One of the things that we didn't talk about is a portfolio that we call Meraki, right, which is a unified threat management type platform, right? It's kind of meant for some of the smaller type businesses, right, that want to bolster their cybersecurity defenses, but maybe they don't have the budget, to go buy a next generation firewall and deploy it, right? So maybe they need some kind of all-in-one, type of solution. Another aspect is cloud-based, type solutions. right? So one of the simplest ways that we can do security is, the human being, right? What if the human being gets that email and he wants to click on the link, right? But what if we actually, had a cloud-based service that replaced DNS from the ISP with a DNS that was actually smart, and the DNS would say, hey, that user clicked on a link and it's going to a site that's known bad, just from the domain name, right? And imagine if it returned a page back to that end user saying, hey, this is a malicious page, right? You're actually building security, right, in a cloud-based model that's something that's very lightweight, doesn't require any kind of implementation. And I think, the smaller organizations can benefit a ton from solutions like OpenDNS, which is what, I just described there. So I think scalability and turning more towards the cloud and, getting the power of the cloud, under the control of, of our customers is extremely important.
Let me put on my journalist hat here for a minute and ask, which would be tougher, recovery for a small organization or recovery for a large one? Because you have two sides of the coin here.
Yeah.
With the small organization, it could be all or nothing. With the large one, you could have a very complicated threat damage picture.
Absolutely.
So, with your sense, with your experience, which do you think is tougher, the small recovery or the large recovery?
I mean, that actually is kind of a tough question, right? Trying to, judge
So that's the
that
journalist jumping in here. So,
well, part of me initially thinks of, when I think of, recovery, I think of what happens after the response action, right? So we have to assume that if what you're talking about recovery, right, we've already responded to the incident, right? And the fourth step of the, cybersecurity function, it's we've, stopped the damage from getting worse, but the aspect now is how to get things back, to normal, right? So when we think about some of these ransomware incidents, for small organizations to have constant backups, right, of all this, information, it's hard to do, right? Any organization struggles with making sure we can do backup and restore, properly. And I think smaller organizations are much more likely to not have all those processes, ironed out and done effectively, right? So I think when I think of in terms of recovery, that's what I think of, and I think of the people and process and all that, knowledge that needs to take place. And smaller organizations are going to have, they're much more impacted, much more handicapped, I suppose I should say, in that area.
question. Do you segment in larger organizations? Do you segment your security solution, or is it umbrellaed over the whole organization?
Yeah, so segmentation, it conjures up a lot of things, right? So, especially, in the DoD, right? Who knows the network segmentation better than in the Department of Defense? I think of, the first thing I think of is, well, what if we can do segmentation by using the network equipment itself? In other words, we know we have to run all this stuff across a network, right? So imagine if we didn't have to put firewalls everywhere, or if we didn't have to put, air gaps, everywhere. Imagine if the actual network itself could act as an enforcer. So that's one of the reasons why, Cisco's been, invested in a technology called TrustSec, right? We actually build the policy about, network segmentation into the equipment itself and let the routers and switches enforce policy. So, for example, if the HVAC system should never talk to a point of sale system, as we've seen in some of these breaches, right? Imagine if the network itself already knew that this was a policy, that this should never happen, right? We all know that in firewall configurations that you layer a change upon a change upon a change. You do a couple of 3 or 4 different personnel turnovers. It's easy to lose track of what that firewall is still doing, right? But if we had a really simple way to control and manage, right, the access control policy and let the network itself do that in enforcing, I think that's one of the steps, towards things like bringing that simplicity, bringing a level of automation, right, bringing a level of, risk management that, hadn't been possible before.
Let's say Cisco, in the course of its security work, discovers a new approach that might be better but doesn't fit the NIST framework. Would you be incorporating that?
Would be if we discovered it, you're asking?
Yes, but it doesn't go into the NIST framework. What do you do then?
Well, I mean, certainly we would, advocate that, to our customers. If we found that, if we thought that we found a better approach, certainly that would be, a key aspect of what we would share with every organization that, wants to talk with us about it. Certainly we would like to also contribute that back, to NIST, right? So, we do have people that contribute, and we have, fed information back, to NIST and through the working groups, right, to make sure that they can learn from our experiences as well. Right? We're not about, to keep all that stuff locked up, right? We want to, to share best practices if we can come across them.
Okay, let me ask one question here I was saving, a broad-based question.
Okay.
Why does your approach represent an improvement over existing security approaches?
Well, I think when I think of the concept of addressing the full attack continuum, and I mentioned people think in terms of threes. I think a lot of times we need to grasp the high-level concepts first, right? And I also think that there's still a lot of confusion around cybersecurity, and a lot of people making it out to be a lot more complex than perhaps it needs to be. So I think when Cisco approaches cybersecurity from the construct of before, during, and after, I think most people can get their head around that, right, and actually start thinking about cybersecurity in that construct, so that way they're ready to take that next level down, right, to actually talk about and maybe whiteboard out what those capabilities need to be, right? So to me, I think what's different about that is just trying to make sure that it's a relatively simple approach that can be grasped at a high level from a CISO to a non-security person, right, to be able to act on it, right? Cybersecurity can't be a prohibitively complicated conversation, but we have to find a way to break through that, and I think we have, right? And even doing things like aligning with the cybersecurity framework makes it that much clearer, in my opinion.
Okay, well, with that, Steve, we've just about run out of time. I want to thank you very much for submitting to an hour's worth of questions from me.
It's my pleasure.
And I want to thank the audience for joining us. We'll have some information, some contact information posted if it isn't up already. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.